At 2 o'clock in the morning on December 14th, 2020, Kent Landry's phone rang with the kind of call every parent dreads. A Texas Highway Patrol trooper was on the line, and he needed to ask Kent some questions. Did Kent have a son named Jason? Did Jason drive a gray Nissan Altima? The trooper explained that they'd found Jason's car wrecked on a remote dirt road outside the small town of Luling, Texas, about 30 miles southeast of San Marcos. The car was crashed into a fence, the keys were still in the ignition, and the headlights were still on. But there was a problem. Jason wasn't there. Kent, a former defense attorney turned pastor, told the trooper he'd be right there. As he drove through the darkness toward the crash site, Kent's mind raced with possibilities. Maybe Jason had been injured in the crash and wandered off looking for help. Maybe he'd been picked up by a passerby and taken to a hospital. But when Kent arrived at the scene on Salt Flat Road, what he found was far more disturbing than he could have imagined. But before we dive into today's story, if you enjoy baffling mysteries and unsolved disappearances told through immersive narrative storytelling, then you've come to the right place, because that's what I do here. And I upload new stories 3 to 4 times every week. So if that interests you, please tell the like button you'll help them study for their big exam, but then just spend the whole time showing them cat videos instead. Also subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future uploads. All right, let's get into today's story, which takes place in Central Texas in December of 2020. Jason Landry was 21 years old and a student at Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas. Friends and family described him as having a golden retriever personality. He was friendly, outgoing, never met a stranger, and was always making friends with new people. He was just a good dude, the kind of guy everyone liked being around. Jason had sent his mom Lisa a Christmas list just the day before, and it was full of the kinds of things you'd expect from a college student. But the highlight of the list was socks. Not just any socks, but colorful, crazy socks. One pair featured a monkey in a suit and tie holding a briefcase and a banana with the words "monkey business" stitched across each ankle. Jason loved his quirky socks. December 13th, 2020 was the last day before Christmas break at Texas State. Jason had finished his finals and was ready to head home to Missouri City, a suburb just outside of Houston, about 160 miles away from his college apartment. The drive home was supposed to be straightforward. He'd take Highway 21 east out of San Marcos, connect to Interstate 10, and follow it all the way to Houston. It was a route he'd driven many times before. That evening, Jason loaded up his gray 2011 Nissan Altima with his laptop, his backpack, some clothes, toiletries, and other belongings he'd need for the holiday break. His roommates would later tell investigators that Jason seemed completely normal when he left. He was excited to get home for Christmas. Around 10:30 p.m., Jason sent some Snapchat messages to friends, showing he was in good spirits, making jokes, talking about typical college stuff. At 11:24 p.m., Jason's phone connected to the navigation app Waze at the intersection of Magnolia Street and Austin Street in Luling, Texas. Now, here's where things start to get strange. If Jason was following his normal route home on Interstate 10, there was absolutely no reason for him to be in Luling. Luling is a small town of about 5,000 people located south of the interstate, and to get there from his apartment, Jason would have had to deliberately exit the highway and drive into town. Investigators would later determine that instead of turning onto Magnolia Street to get back to I-10, Jason continued straight on Austin Street, which eventually turns into Salt Flat Road, a long gravel road that winds through rural oil fields. At 11:26 p.m., his phone last connected to Waze. After that, there was no more phone activity. Sometime around midnight, a volunteer firefighter happened to be driving down Salt Flat Road when his headlights illuminated something unexpected. A gray Nissan Altima was crashed in a ditch, the front end smashed into a barbed wire fence. The car's headlights were still on, cutting through the darkness. The firefighter stopped and called 911. He walked up to the vehicle and peered inside. The keys were in the ignition. The car was running. But there was no driver. The firefighter walked up and down the road with his flashlight, calling out, looking for someone who might be injured and lying in the brush. But he found no one. He reported to the 911 dispatcher that he'd found an abandoned vehicle but couldn't locate the driver anywhere. A Texas Department of Public Safety trooper arrived at the scene around 1 a.m. Body camera footage from that night shows the trooper examining the vehicle and the surrounding area. He noted that the car had gone sideways off the road before hitting the fence. All of Jason's belongings were inside the vehicle: his backpack, his laptop, his wallet with all his identification and credit cards, his cell phone. But as the trooper walked along the dark road with his flashlight, he started finding something deeply disturbing. Clothes. Jason's clothes were scattered along Salt Flat Road for roughly 900 feet. First, the trooper found a t-shirt, then pants, then underwear. Some of the clothing had what appeared to be blood on it. The trooper could see on his body camera that this was not looking like a typical car accident anymore. When Kent Landry arrived at the crash site in those early morning hours, he was shocked by what he saw. Or more accurately, by what he didn't see. He'd expected to find police vehicles, search teams, people actively looking for his son. Instead, there was almost no one there. The car had been searched and basic evidence collected, but there were no massive search operations underway. Kent walked along the road with his own flashlight and found even more of Jason's clothing scattered about. And that's when he saw them. The socks. Bright yellow SpongeBob SquarePants socks. He immediately recognized them as Jason's. Kent also found Jason's flip-flops lying on the road. He stood there in the dark, trying to understand what could have possibly happened. His son's car was wrecked but drivable. All of Jason's belongings were inside. But Jason had apparently stripped off all his clothes in near-freezing temperatures and walked away into the darkness. It made absolutely no sense. As the sun came up that morning, a full-scale search operation began. Caldwell County Sheriff's Office brought in search dogs, drones, volunteers on foot, even forward-looking infrared technology to detect heat signatures. They searched the surrounding area thoroughly. Salt Flat Road runs through active oil fields, so investigators from the Texas Railroad Commission searched all the oil tanks and reservoir tanks in the area, thinking maybe Jason had fallen into one. They found nothing irregular. Search teams combed through fields, checked abandoned buildings, looked in every shed and structure for miles around. But there was no sign of Jason Landry anywhere. Not a footprint, not a piece of additional clothing, not a single trace. As the investigation continued over the following weeks and months, digital forensics specialists analyzed Jason's phone and computer. They found absolutely nothing to suggest Jason was planning to meet anyone in Luling. There were no text messages, no calls, no social media messages setting up any kind of meeting. His phone data showed he'd traveled directly from his apartment in San Marcos to Luling without stopping anywhere suspicious. Investigators also found no evidence that Jason was involved in buying or selling drugs, despite some speculation about that possibility in online forums. His social media showed he was a typical college student who occasionally smoked marijuana, but nothing more serious than that. The Caldwell County Sheriff's Office, led by Captain Jeff Ferry, conducted an extensive investigation and released a detailed report of their findings. Based on all the evidence, they concluded that Jason appeared to have been in a single-car accident and that there was no evidence of foul play. No evidence that another person was involved. No evidence that this was anything other than a tragic accident. But that conclusion left one massive question completely unanswered. If this was just a car accident, where is Jason Landry? And why would he take off all his clothes in near-freezing temperatures and walk away from his vehicle into complete darkness? Several theories have emerged to try to explain what happened. The most widely discussed theory involves something called paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon that can occur in the late stages of hypothermia. When someone becomes severely hypothermic, their body sometimes experiences what's called a cold-induced vasodilation, where peripheral blood vessels suddenly dilate, causing a rush of blood to the skin. This creates an intense sensation of heat, and the person, now confused and disoriented from the hypothermia, begins removing their clothing because they feel like they're burning up. It's a documented medical phenomenon that has been seen in numerous hypothermia cases. The problem with this theory in Jason's case is that he would have had to become hypothermic extremely quickly. The temperature that night was around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold but not immediately life-threatening. And paradoxical undressing typically happens in the very late stages of hypothermia, after someone has been exposed to cold for an extended period. Another theory suggested by some, including a former FBI agent who reviewed the case, is that Jason may have experienced some kind of mental health crisis or reaction to a substance that caused him to act erratically. The crash itself might have been caused by impairment or disorientation, and then, in his confused state, he removed his clothing and wandered off into the darkness. However, toxicology tests couldn't be performed without a body, so this remains speculation. A third theory, one that Jason's father Kent has not entirely ruled out, is that another person was somehow involved. Maybe someone came across Jason at the crash site and something went wrong. Maybe there was foul play. But investigators found absolutely no evidence to support this theory. No tire tracks from other vehicles. No witnesses reporting seeing anything suspicious. No forensic evidence suggesting another person was present. In February 2022, the case was turned over to the Texas Attorney General's Cold Case and Missing Persons Unit because the small Caldwell County Sheriff's Office simply didn't have the resources to dedicate to such a complex case. The Attorney General's office conducted hundreds of hours of additional investigation. They obtained geofence search warrants for the area, analyzing data from every phone that was near Salt Flat Road that night. They brought in experts in digital forensics, accident reconstruction, and geospatial sciences. In November 2023, they held an extensive roundtable review with experts from the FBI, Texas Rangers, Texas Search and Rescue, and other agencies. After thoroughly examining all the evidence, the panel concluded that all credible leads had been pursued and that no new evidence had been discovered. The case remains open and active, but investigators admit they simply don't know what happened to Jason Landry. Kent and Lisa Landry have not given up hope, though Kent admits they've had to accept that they may never get the answers they desperately seek. As a pastor, Kent says his faith tells him that one day he'll see his son again in heaven, even if that's many years from now. In the meantime, the family holds an annual candlelight vigil at the crash site on Salt Flat Road every December 13th, and volunteer search teams continue to comb the area a couple times a month, still hoping that maybe someone will spot something that's been overlooked. The family has added new members since Jason disappeared. His brother got married to someone Jason never got to meet. There are nieces and nephews who will never know their Uncle Jason. Life has moved forward in many ways, but the central question remains unanswered. What happened on Salt Flat Road on December 13, 2020? How does a 21-year-old college student, driving home for Christmas on a route he'd taken many times before, end up on a remote gravel road miles off course, crash his car, strip off all his clothes in near-freezing weather, and vanish without a trace? There's a $20,000 reward for information that could help solve this mystery. So that's going to do it. Until next time, see ya.